Hello everyone and welcome to part 3 of the psychobiology unit. Now in the previous section we were talking about the parts of the nervous system as well as starting the parts of the brain, the central nervous system. So we talked a bit about the lobes and the cerebral cortex and how that breaks down. Well, right now we're going to talk about the different parts of the brain from more of like a top-down perspective. So the forebrain houses that cerebral cortex we just divided into lobes, right? And then we have the midbrain and the hindbrain, and we're going to look at those different structures and what they contain. So we have those two hemispheres. You can't see them in this picture, but remember that sheep brain picture where they kind of squeeze it open a little bit? Those, you have the left and right hemispheres, your cerebral cortex, so all those things we talked about previously are housed within the forebrain, that top region. Then you have your subcortical structures. They're kind of like below, inside of the cerebral cortex, like inward a little bit. But that's your hypothalamus, your thalamus, your pituitary gland, and your limbic system. So your pituitary gland is known as a master gland. It helps with the secretion and regulation of your hormones, whereas the thalamus is like your sensory relay center. So when you hear something, or you taste something, or you see something, the thalamus kind of sorts it out into its respective cortices. So think of like Inside Out. If y'all have seen that movie, when they have their little command station and they regulate the emotions, they watch what's going on and regulate the emotions, the same kind of thing happens with our thalamus and our sensory experiences. It regulates and sends those experiences to their respective cortices. Now the limbic system is important because it's very involved with our emotions and our memory. This contains your hippocampus, your amygdala, and your hypothalamus. Now, your hypothalamus helps with your homeostatic processes. These are going to be regulating your body's set points, your temperature, your heart rate, your breathing, those types of things we don't have to think about. Your amygdala is very important for your emotion and your aggression. And your hippocampus is going to be very involved with your memory and learning. This, as a system, the limbic system, helps us tie emotions to our memory so that amygdala and hippocampus work closely to have those memories, whereas the hypothalamus, you have those physical experiences. So, if you've ever thought about something really embarrassing and you get a little sick to your stomach, thank you, limbic system, because that's going to kind of conjure up those emotions and those memories involved with them. The memories and the emotions involved with them. Next, we're going to talk about our midbrain. So, looking at that green region in this picture, this is where your reticular formation is housed, as well as the substantia nigra, which just means black substance, as well as the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. So these are very important for your movement and your sleep-wake cycle, but movement mainly. Substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area, I'm not really sure the difference in their functions, if I'm going to be quite honest with you. But, we separate these brain structures based on how we know they function. So I know there's a lot of overlap in these structures, but just know, we sometimes we group them according to the function. We see that these different circuits are working together, and the midbrain's very important with that movement. So just be able to kind of differentiate which parts of the brain do what, like know the lobes are divisions of the cerebral cortex, where the cerebral cortex is housed, and how, the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain differentiate in function. So the hindbrain, aka your brainstem, this is going to be like the bottom, like closest to your, that was my Chicago coming out, the bottom. It's going to be your spinal cord, that connection back here. It's going to consist of the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So the medulla is going to help with those automatic processes of the autonomic nervous system, if you remember what that means. If you don't, go watch part 1 and refresh, or part 2. The pons is going to connect your brain to your spinal cord. That's really important. That is how we get the messages out and the messages in to our brain. And it helps regulate brain activity during sleep. And then we have the cerebellum. I don't know, this always helps me. Bellum balance. That helps me remember the function of the cerebellum. But it helps with your coordination, your movement, and your motor skills. So these are just kind of like these parts of the brain in a nutshell. So what happens when, we experience brain damage? Well, it varies based on the person, the regions that are damaged, and the severity of the damage. So I've included a brief video on Phineas Gage, which is a world-renowned case in brain damage. He was like a railroad worker, and like they were laying down track or something, and a like iron rod that they were using, hammering in, blew up and went through his like cheekbone, as you see in this picture, through his cheekbone, like through his eye socket, and out of his head. It's amazing he didn't die. And he became this world-renowned like case in psychology and brain studies. Like, what happens when you have damage? Like, when you live like that, what's the extent of the damage? And so his doctor went on to talk a bit about his case. Well, this video explains like what really happened, because there's a lot of myth surrounding Phineas Gage, and I think this video does a good job of clearing it up. Now, with our brain, how do we know where these different parts are? There's a lot of imaging kind of techniques that we use. We use computerized different scans can show us different things about the brain. And a lot of what we learn about the brain is as a result of seeing like brain damage. People with brain damage, studying their brain kind of gives us an idea of what functions are inhibited due to what damage. But obviously this may be a little harder to generalize, so sometimes we like to take imaging techniques to see what the brain does during different tasks, or maybe how a brain looks when it has abnormal functioning. How do we figure out what parts do what? Well, we use these brain imaging techniques to kind of illuminate this picture. We have CT scans, or a CAT scan. Y'all may have had one of these before. This is x-rays of your body and brain, so it's just a picture. It's very stagnant, but it can show us a lot of things. Then we have positron emission tomography scan, or a PET scan. Creates pictures of the living, active brain. So people digest what is called a tracer, and it goes into their bloodstream, and we're able to see paint a picture of the brain using the dye as it moves throughout the brain, so we can see it. It's pretty cool. Then we have MRIs, or magnetic resonance imaging. This uses a magnetic field to take a picture of our brain. And then we also have fMRIs, which are functional magnetic resonance imaging. These are better than, in my opinion, better than MRIs if you're looking for more like what the brain does during what process. So it kind of sees the changes in the brain activity over time. It's not so stagnant, and tracks that blood flow and oxygen levels. And it tends to be more accurate than PET scans, which try to do a similar thing, but using the tracer. And then an EEG, or electroencephalography. This is going to measure the brain's electrical activity. So this could be like any kind of psychological study where you see someone like hooked up with the little electrodes in their brain and they're like playing a video game. That's how we measure that different brain activity. We're seeing, that electrical activity doing certain tasks or watching certain things to kind of see what parts of the brain are illuminated while completing those tasks. And these imaging kind of paint a picture for us in what parts of the brain are most relevant for certain processes, like memory, like playing a game, like certain like prolonged periods of attention. We can use it for so many things. Psychobiology is such a vast field, especially looking at the neurology component. Oh, and next, really quickly, this is an activity called the Shower Cap Mind Map. Excuse me. This is extra credit. If you want to do this, what you basically need to do is take a shower cap or a head. You can make a drawing and label your own brain according to the instructions here. Now, if you want extra credit points for this, I will give you 5 points if you do this. You will have 1 point for each thing you have to do here, each number, and then 1 point for presenting it to me. So to present it with me, you'll just have to email me, make an appointment, and we'll go on to Collaborate, Blackboard Collaborate, and you can show me your little brain you made, and I'll give you 5 extra credit points. But you'll have to label each lobe of the brain. It works best if you have a shower cap, like, a cheapy one from the dollar store, and you have someone you could just put it on their head and label it accordingly. Yeah, but I have had students who just got a shower cap and stuffed it with, like, paper towels or something to hold it up, or a pillow. Get creative, but 5 extra credit points if you do that. And it helps you learn the material. It helps you place the parts of the brain, like figure out exactly where they are. So the last couple of things I want to mention were terms of the hormones. I know I talked about the endocrine system very briefly because we have those different parts like the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the pineal gland, the adrenal gland, the pancreas, the ovaries, the testes. These all secrete associated hormones that you can see here. Well, those hormones each have different functions. And so when we're talking about the pituitary gland, that has a lot to do with puberty. If y'all have ever went through like sex ed or something, talk about pituitary gland and how it helps, stimulate certain parts of the body to produce that growth hormone. And that helps with regulating growth and hormone release for developing like secondary sex characteristics. And so all of these different hormones kind of work in a similar way as the neurotransmitters, except they're based in like our blood. So check out this. Make sure you read that section and understand that. Lastly, I want to talk about a note on sex and gender, because we're talking about biology and psychobiology and how it relates. How does the body relate to the mind? Well, this is kind of giving us a bridge to what we're about to start in looking at psychology. We're looking at parts of the brain, right? We have hormones and how they determine our sex characteristics. We have genetics. Right, we have different parts of the brain for how we think about things. Well, all these come together on these ideas of gender and sex. Gender versus sex. We use those interchangeably. But what's the difference? Sex is going to be what you are assigned at birth. So I use this gender unicorn chart, which is really helpful for explaining these different concepts. So your sex assigned at birth, that's what we usually mean by sex. We have male, female, and intersex. So sometimes people are born with reproductive organs from both sexes. This is often dichotomized as just male and female. But we forget that some people are born with both, or a mixture. There's a ton of different combinations. Then we have this idea of gender. Now gender, according to this gender unicorn chart, we have gender identity is how someone identifies. So maybe people identify as female, maybe people identify as male, maybe people identify as other or non-binary. That's how their identity, that's part of who they are. That's important for when we talk about psychology and developing our self-concept. Now gender expression is how we express who we are, how we express that identity. So maybe someone identifies as female and their gender expression is very feminine. Or maybe someone identifies as female, but their gender expression is very masculine. Those are those different concepts. Then we have the idea of non-binary, binary, cisgender, transgender, which I think we've all heard these words before, but I just want a little clarification of what we mean by them. Because when we're talking in our class, we're going to talk a lot about male and female. And that is largely going to refer to someone's sex assigned at birth, unless otherwise stated like gendered. So just make a note of that in our text. But the terms cisgender just means, someone who acts in accordance with their sex assigned at birth. Their gender matches their sex assigned at birth. Transgender is someone whose gender identity does not match with their sex assigned at birth. So these are people who may have been born biologically female, but they identify as male, or vice versa. Binary, so when we talk about the gender binary, we're just talking about male and female. So people talk about what it means to be a woman, and what it means to be a man. So we've dichotomized this because we have different stereotypes for each men and women. And so when we talk about the binary, we're talking about two choices between gender identity and expression. Now, there are more than two choices. There's all the spectrum in between. But because of how we're born and how people talk about this conversation, it tends to be dichotomized. We only see it as two categories and kind of look over the in-between. This is just your friendly reminder that there are a whole slew of expectations in between. So sometimes people don't want to fit that binary, male and female. Sometimes they just like to float in the middle, or they identify somewhere in the middle. That's what we mean by non-binary. And so how does this relate? Because I know this seems kind of random to talk about this, but I think our language is important in understanding what it means between sex and gender, and what gender carries for psychology. Well, we have gender stereotypes and roles, expectations we have for people based on their gender or their gender expression. We have social learning theory, how people come to learn about gender because it is a social construct. How do people learn what they're supposed to do as a man or supposed to do as a woman? We think of gender discrimination, social psychology. Sometimes those stereotypes lead us to behave in different ways. We have things like ambivalent sexism, which is, discrimination women face, usually, or, I want to say female identifying people face as a result of their gender identity. So there's hostile sexism as well as benevolent sexism. So this is kind of these prejudices, like the hostile ones are more negative qualities women face, like not being as competent in STEM fields. That's a stereotype that can affect someone's self-esteem, their self-concept, their capabilities, right? It's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy type thing. We're going to talk about that. And there's also benevolent sexism. Sexism. The idea that women are wonderful. When a woman commits the same crime as a man, she's not taken as seriously sometimes. Or she gets off more lenient punishments. So that idea that women are more benevolent. These psychological theories relate back to gender. This social construct based on how we assign someone's assigned sex at birth. It's really interesting when you think about that process. Like, okay, they're born this way. We're going to have them identify this way. And they're going to have these types of roles and characteristics because that's what we expect. It's really interesting. We're going to talk about this more. But if you have any questions on any of the reading, please let me know. Email me or put it in the Cyber Cafe. And remember to do that guided reading assignment. I hope you all have a wonderful week.